"Don't lift my skirt. I'm not clean," she begged, but the rancher had paid, so he did. And froze the wind came hard off the mesa and dragged grit across Garnet Ridge until the whole town looked smudged with ash. Dust stuck to faces, found the weak parts of doors, pried into the spaces people tried to keep clean. It was a place that made survivors of some, sinners of others, and ghosts of the rest. Under that dry sky, a man could build a life or lose it in a night. Caleb Rourke tied his horse outside the Painted Lily and ignored the looks that followed him from the boardwalk. His hat brimmed through shadow over eyes that had not slept much since the fire on his north range. Smoke had drunk his fences and spooked half his herd. Men with brand irons like knives had pushed through the chaos and stolen what they could. Could put the word rustler on them if you wanted. Caleb called them by another name that didn't sit well in daylight. He had come to town to buy lumber and hire hands. He had come to see the sheriff about a wire through with bad news. He had come to pick up a length of silver ribbon he'd ordered months ago to tie his sister's hair when she visited in the spring. But the ribbon wasn't in the milliner's window. It was looped around the wrist of a woman he'd glimpsed between the slats of the Painted Lily's half-drawn curtains. Pale against her sun-worn skin like a touch of snow in July, there were prettier girls in the Painted Lily, younger too. But something about the ribbon, about the way the woman's hand half hid it as she poured whiskey and smiled without meaning it, pulled him like thirst toward a well. He knew it wasn't his place to ask her where she got it. He knew better than to step into a room where men bought warmth and forgot names. He went in anyway. The saloon smelled like stale smoke and spilled sweet, like somebody had tried to drown sadness in cheap perfume. Men hunched over cards and knocked back bad choices. The piano clattered under a woman with a red flower in her hair, and Vince Malloy leaned his elbows over his balcony office as a king might glance down at a crowd he owned. He was the sort of man who wore velvet when the world wore mud. Caleb didn't look up. He looked at the woman with the ribbon and the careful smile, and he set a gold coin on the bar. The room tilted a little, as if somebody had leaned their shoulder against the wall, but Caleb didn't flinch. The woman didn't either. She came around the bar and led him to the stairs. Her steps were light. He noticed the way she kept the ribbon hidden, as if privacy were the last thing she owned. At the top of the stairs, in a room that smelled of boiled linens and wilted violets, she turned to him and reached for the lamp. "Don't," she whispered, and the word was a plea so small it felt like a bird with a broken wing in his hands. "Don't lift my skirt. I'm not clean." Caleb stopped where he was. The coin he'd given downstairs might as well have been a rock thrown into a well. Could feel it sinking. "Hey," he said quietly. "You don't have to. It's what I'm paid for," she said, aiming the words like a shield. "It's what you came for." He took off his hat. He kept his distance, because it felt like any step closer would be a kind of harm. "That ribbon," he said gently. "Where? Did you come by it?" Her eyes flicked down, then up again. They were the sort of eyes that had seen a long road and things she didn't tell anybody about. "A man gave it to me once, a long time ago." Caleb looked at the looped silver that lay against the bones of her wrist. He knew its weave. He'd picked it from a catalog in Denver for a girl he loved when he had more hope than sense. He had watched that girl tie it in her dark hair when the wind blew hard across their valley and thought his life couldn't be made any better. "Lila," said, and the name was a prayer. The woman's mouth opened and closed without sound. She stepped back as if the floor had tilted under her. The lamp stuttered. Her hand rose to her throat and then fell like it had forgotten how to hold. "Caleb?" she whispered. "Oh, Caleb." He could see her then, not just the woman the Painted Lily had painted her to be, but the girl who'd run barefoot over creek stones behind his mother's kitchen, who'd pressed peaches into jars with sticky hands and laughed when the jar slipped, and they both tasted summer right then and there. He could see the way she'd cried quietly the day his father had put his hand on Caleb's shoulder and said, "Rourkes don't marry poor," like it was something written in the rocks. He could see the way her jaw had set hard as fence posts when her father's debt came due and men with cold eyes and smooth hands came calling. He hadn't seen Lila Boone in 4 years. Not since the day he went to her clapboard house and found the door open and the cupboards bare and her mother's good brass pot gone. Not since he found a note that said, "I will not be the ruin of you." He had looked for her until the sky went black, and then he had looked when the sky was pale. In the end, he had told himself she'd gone to family in Kansas. He had told himself she'd found somebody kinder than him. He had told himself anything that wasn't this. He took one step, and she took one too. He saw her eyes flick to the corner where a metal cuff hung from a bolt sunk into the baseboard. He saw the way she shifted so that her skirt hit it. He heard his own breath go rough. "I didn't come for that," he said. I came for lumber. I saw your ribbon. I gave you that. I couldn't. Lila, I couldn't just walk back out." Lila's shoulders fell, and she folded onto the edge of the narrow bed, palms on her knees, fingers trembling. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she said. "Not ever. It was easier when I thought you'd never know." Caleb set his hat on the chair by the window and went to his knees in front of her. He didn't take her hands. He set his own on the worn boards, palms open. "You were gone," he said. "I thought they took my father's debt," she said, voice steadying like a rider who'd found her seat again. "Said a house and a team and a year's wages didn't cover it. Said I could make it right working upstairs in town. Said it was respectable compared to a mining camp. They said a lot of things. I believed the ones that hurt the least." "I'll pay it," Caleb said, as if that could set the world right. "I'll pay whatever number Malloy can count to." She shook her head and smiled a little broken smile. "They change the number every time a man puts his hand on me. The ledger's never clean because it isn't meant to be. You know that? Outside, a piano hit a sour note, somebody cursed, and somebody laughed too loud and too long. Dust rattled. In the windows, sash-like bones. Caleb sat on the floor, his knees against the edge of the bed, and he looked up at her the way a boy looks up at a girl he thinks is too good to touch. It had been a long time since he'd felt like a boy. "Don't lift my skirt," she said. Softly again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a plea to be spared shame. It was a plea that he'd not see the bruise at her thigh, the scar at her ankle from the cuff, the map of marks that told the story of the last 4 years like a book nobody should have to read. "You'll see what I carry, and you'll never be able to unsee it." "I've been carrying a long time too," he said. "It's not the same. I know it isn't. But you were part of me, and then you were gone, and the space you left made rooms inside me nothing could fill." He reached toward the hem of her skirt and then stopped. His hand shook, not with desire, with fear he didn't deserve this moment. With grief, he hadn't given his hands permission to feel. He looked up at her, waiting, only to see she whispered, only to know, not what the coin buys. She closed her eyes like she was walking into water she wasn't sure she could stand in. He lifted the fabric to her knee, and a thin chain glinted at her ankle where the skirt hid. He froze as if the chain had been a snake. It wasn't the iron cuff. The cuff lay nearby, ugly as a curse. This was a chain made of copper, fine enough to be pretty on a Sunday morning. Hanging from it was a locket made of cheap tin with a flower, scratched into it by a knife so dull it looked more like a thumbprint than art. He knew that locket. They had sat on the porch behind his mother's house the summer they were 19, and he had taken his pocket knife and a tin that had held hard candy at Christmas time and cut the pieces and bent the edges and burned his fingers, soldering them with a spoon heated over a candle. He had made it clumsy and loving and sure it would last forever. Beside he had written LB with a nail. "Lila." He breathed. She opened her eyes. She looked down at him. And for a second, he saw the girl who'd once dangled her legs off the porch and teased him for the way he chewed on words like jerky when he talked about the future. She pulled the locket free and put it in his hand. "I wore it when they brought me here," she said. "They almost took it." Malloy stopped them, said a woman who clung to a tin heart was good for business. "He knows where everybody's soft parts are. I'll pay the debt," Caleb said again, because he needed a hope that sounded like action. "I'll sell my breeding studs. I'll sell my east pasture. If I have to." "You think I want you to give up your life for mine?" she asked, but there was no heat in it. Only fear that love could be the ruin of him, the way she'd once written in a note. "I think I already gave up the good parts when I lost you." He said, "I think my life without you is noise and dust. I think Malloy gets nothing that doesn't belong to him by God's law or mine." He was still waiting when Jess came at a run, breath smoking in the cool air. "North Range," he panted. "They drove the stragglers. Malloy's men, I swear by it. Rex Kincaid riding." Caleb looked at the saloon door as if it could give him an answer. He looked at Jess with his urgency like a hand on his arm pulling. "Go," Jess said, reading his face like a map. "I'll get the sheriff rolling. She's not coming out of that door tonight. If Malloy can help it, you go keep Malloy from helping himself to your brand while you think about it." It was a cruel, practical truth. Caleb's land gave Leela a place to go. If he lost it, he'd be rescuing her into a hole. He swallowed the knife in his throat and swung up onto his horse. "Tell her," he said. Didn't know how Jess would. But he wanted the words said to somebody. "Tell her I'm coming back." He rode out under stars that looked close enough to touch. He rode with the sound of hooves like thunder rolling, and his heart tighter than a cinch on a wild horse. He hit the north fence and saw the break like a wound. He saw shadows moving where his cattle should have bedded. He saw the flash of a gun and then the flash of another. He smelled singed hair and fear. He didn't think, just rode. It was ugly because it always is. It was quick because it sometimes is. In the end, he and Jess and 3 hands ran off Kincaid and his thieves and cut the fire away from the fence and stood panting in the black night. While cows muttered and stomped and settled again, as if nothing had happened, Caleb climbed down and put his hands on his knees and breathed like a man who had been sprinting his whole life and had just realized he could stop. Jess touched his shoulder. "Sheriff ran them to the ridge," he said. "They'll scatter for a night or 2. You got time to do what you need?" Caleb wiped his face with the back of his hand. He felt old and brand new at the same time. He swung back into the saddle. He reached Garnet Ridge, while the eastern horizon was still deciding what color to be. The town was quiet in that way towns are right before morning kicks them in the ribs and tells them to get up and face whatever they've earned. The Painted Lily's door was locked. Caleb went around to the back where deliveries came and where the truth lived. He climbed the stairs to the back hall and stepped into a hush that made his skin prickle. He rounded the corner into Lila's hallway and stopped. A girl who carried water in turned sheets when men were done stood with her back pressed flat to the wall. Her eyes were wide with the kind of fear that has an aside of courage. She looked 19 if you didn't count the lines in her face. He took her out the side. She whispered, "Malloy said he had to recoup losses," said a man with money. "In Canyon City made a better offer. She fought. He hit her. Told me to keep my mouth shut. But you looked like somebody who would do something." She left this. The girl pulled something from her apron pocket and pushed it into his hands. It was the locket. Ah! The tin flower was warm from her skin. Caleb's stomach fell through him. How long? An hour? Maybe less. She looked toward the stairs, like she expected Malloy to come back right then. "You won't tell him it was me who told you?" "I'll tell him it was God," Caleb said. His voice shook the way a man's does when he has run out of places to put his rage and has only prayer left to hold it. He ran. Jess was waiting in the alley on a horse he'd borrowed from the livery. They pounded out of town with dawn behind them and canyon ahead. The land narrowed and the world became rock and silence and the sound of hooves. They could see dust ahead like a ribbon. They could see a wagon weaving along the trail that cut between red stone. 3 men rode alongside the wagon. Malloy sat. The seat, like a man, sits a carriage in church on Sunday, upright and smug. A heavy-set man with a pistol rode on the left, another behind. A 4th Rex Kincaid, the rustler, brought up the rear like a vulture who'd remembered he wanted more meat. Caleb lifted his hand and Jess angled left. They split. They came in hard and fast, and for a second Malloy didn't see them, because men like him never look where a dangerous thing might come from. "Malloy," Caleb shouted, and the shout bounced off the canyon walls and came back sounding like 20 men. "Pull that wagon up." Malloy started. He lifted his hand and didn't. The heavy-set man on the left swung his pistol and fired. The shot went wide. Jess answered. The world exploded into noise. Caleb slid his horse in close and grabbed the bridle of Malloy's team. He saw Leela in the back of the wagon with her hands bound and her hair fallen, and her lips split. He saw the way she held herself steady, and the way she looked at him, and didn't look at him all in the same breath. He saw the way her eyes didn't have fear in them anymore. It's just sorrow and a kind of iron. "Let her down," Caleb said, eyes on Malloy. He had his pistol pulled, but he kept it low because the idea of pointing a gun at a human being made a new kind of sickness in his belly that wasn't fear. "Be sensible," Malloy yelled, and he sounded for the first time like a man whose suit, jacket hit a coward. "She belongs to a gentleman who knows what his coin buys. You want virtue? Marry a preacher's daughter. You want Lila Boone? Put your bid on the table like a man?" Caleb felt the world tilt. He knew this place. He had been here before, on porches, at tables, in rooms with ledgers. Men told him what could and couldn't be done. Men told him what was his and wasn't. Men told him to be sensible, and he had been, and it had cost him everything that mattered. "Lila Boone," he called, keeping his eyes on Malloy. "I'm sorry I let other men's rules say what I could. Hold. I'm sorry I believed money could buy back what greed stole. I should have come sooner. I should have been braver. I should have stood in a doorway 4 years ago and not let anybody pass. I love you. I love you like I love the land. Taught me my own name. And if I walk away now because this man tells me to, that love is nothing and I'm nothing, so I won't walk away." Malloy's lip curled. "Pretty speech," he sneered. "Let me tell you something about love, Mr. Rourke. It makes a weak man poorer. It makes a poor woman expensive. You ain't got the kind of coin this costs." Lifted his pistol and leveled it at Caleb's chest. "Malloy," Jess barked from the ridge, "look where you aim." Malloy flicked his eyes. That was all the second needed. Leela had been pushing with her bound hands against the backboard of the wagon. The wood had a rotten place. She had found it with the stubbornness of a woman who has decided to break her own prison with her body if she has to. The board gave. She slid like water and hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up on her knees behind the wheel. Malloy swore and swung his gun toward her. Caleb didn't think. He dropped his reins and stepped between the barrel of that pistol and the woman he loved. "Here," he said. And Malloy's eyes widened, because men like him don't always believe a man will become a wall. The shot came. It slammed into Caleb's left shoulder with a force that made him stagger. The world went white around the edges like a winter morning. Somewhere above and to the left, Jess fired. The heavy-set man who'd been dreaming of a fight he could win fell out of his saddle. Kincaid wheeled his horse and ran, because cowards who make their living in the dark don't often stand in the day. Malloy sat there, pistol empty, face like wax melting. His horse sidestepped. The wagon horses stamped and rolled their eyes. He looked from Lila to Caleb to Jess and did what he did best. He smiled as if he'd arranged all of it. "This ends in a court," he said. "I've papers. I've lawmen. Who, like me?" Lila had crawled to Caleb while he stood swaying and trying to figure out if he could lift his right arm. She reached up and braced him with her shoulder. "I have a confession," she said, and her voice cut through dust and pain and dried blood like the sound of cold water. She wasn't looking at Caleb. She was looking at Malloy. "For years ago, I didn't leave town because I wanted money. I left because your man at the bank came to my father and said he'd foreclose and leave. I was sleeping under the house if I didn't agree to work for you. He said you'd tear up the paper if I went with the cart, smiling, and didn't make trouble. He told me this town would be kinder to my mother if I played along. You put a cuff on my ankle and a ledger in my face and called that a choice. You to say, here where the canyon can hear you, that you threatened my family, and that you sold me when it suited you, that all your tidy numbers are nothing but robbery." Malloy laughed then. But it wasn't the sound a man makes when something amuses him. It was the sound a heart makes when it's so rotten it's forgotten what soft feels like. "You got men who'll say I did all that?" he asked. "You got paper? You got signatures? You got anything but tears?" Lila lifted her chin. "I've got the truth. And I've got his blood on my skirt, and the whole town's going too. See it! And I've got the sheriff following behind because Jess Delgado ran hard. And I've got your own man." She flicked her eyes to the heavy-set body in the dust. "Who told the doctor last month that you kept numbers 2 ways. Jess. Heard him. The doctor will say it. I've got whatever God there is in this canyon, and I think he's tired of you. Caleb swayed. Lila's arm was strong under his. He didn't speak because sometimes a man has to let the woman who has been silent too long make the noise. Jess came down the slope with his gun steady and his jaw tight. Sheriff Harlan Pike rode in from the south with 2 deputies and a look on his face like there wouldn't be any more pretending. Malloy's smile flickered. "Vince Malloy," the sheriff said. No hurry in his voice, no anger either, just a tired kind of dignity. "You're under arrest for kidnapping and conspiracy to defraud, plus whatever else I can pull out of your pockets when I empty them. You can try that paper talk. I've been listening to folks claim those papers give them rights they ain't got since I wore short pants." Malloy lifted his hands like a gentleman in church receiving the plate. "What a pity," he said. "The town will miss me. We'll miss your soft carpets," the sheriff said. "We won't miss the way you count. Step down easy, Malloy, step down easy." He tried to walk easy too, but his knees shook. The deputies took his arms. Jess checked the heavy-set man. He breathed out and shook his head. Kincaid had disappeared into rock and sunlight like a lizard.
Oh.
The sheriff looked to Caleb. "You stand firm, Rourke?" he asked. Caleb exhaled slowly. "I stand as firm as a man with a hole in his shoulder can." "Then sit down," the sheriff said. "Before you fall." They bound Lila's wrists free, and Jess wrapped a bandana around Caleb's shoulder, and the deputies set Malloy on a horse with his hands tied and a rope to the saddle horn. They all rode back into town like the tail end of a storm that wants to think it means something. By noon, the whole of Garnet Ridge knew more than it had known at sunrise. Papers came out of Malloy's desk like snakes out of a woodpile, and some had 2 numbers on them because greed is rarely neat. The girl who had put the locket in Caleb's hands found her courage bigger than her fear, and she stood on the painted lily's stoop and told her own story to anyone who would hear it. Doctor told what he'd heard. The banker's color changed 3 different shades, and outside the church, under the cottonwood that had thrown shade over too many lies. Caleb sat with his back against the trunk while the doc sewed him shut, and Lila held his good hand and looked at his face like it was something she could read, and had been waiting a long time to open. "Tell me again," she whispered. Not because she hadn't heard him before, but because sometimes a broken heart needs to hear the same words more than once. "What you said in the canyon. I love you," he said. "I love you recklessly and late, and the way a man loves water when he hasn't had it. I loved you when you planted beans behind my mother's kitchen. Note, so I wouldn't follow, and I followed anyway and failed. I love you in ways that make other things small. I will say it until you tell me you don't want to hear it anymore, and then I will whisper it under my breath." She laughed, a small sound that felt large because it was the first one he had heard in his bones. Tears tracked down her face like a rain the land had needed. "I left because I thought loving you was a harm," she said. "I left because men who smiled told me it would save my mother. I left because I didn't think we could be bigger than papers and ledgers and voices that speak like stone. I'm done letting fear dress up like wisdom." He closed his eyes because her words hurt in a place that felt holy. "Then let's go home," he said. And the word home felt like a new house built on ground where the old one had burned. They rode out of town late that afternoon with Jess and 3 women from the church who had packed blankets and pans and things that make a house a haven. They didn't marry that day, because some promises are sweeter for waiting just long enough to breathe. They took the long road so the light could make the grass look like it had never been dry. They reached the Rourke Ranch when the sun lay down on the mountains like somebody had set a copper kettle on the rim of the world. Caleb showed her the kitchen where his mother had taught him to stir stew with his left hand and hold the pot with his right. He showed her the porch where he had made her a locket with a dull knife and a candy tin and a faith he thought he had lost but hadn't. He showed her the room that had once been his wife's. She took his hand and shook her head. "Let's start fresh," she said softly. "That room can hold the past. I want a place that doesn't say anyone's name but ours." "That sounds like something a wise woman said once," he answered. "I stole it from a girl I used to be. She said they ate stew under lamplight, with the sounds of cows like a hymn through the open window. They slept dreamless for the first time in years, with their hands close enough to touch if they needed to. Garnet. Ridge still had nights when the wind brought grit to the sill, and days when men said the wrong things at the wrong time, and Sundays when the preacher spoke as if he had known all along who was right. Vince Malloy went to trial in a courtroom where wood creaked and truth did what it could. He found that papers torn in half have a way of making other papers look bad. There were other Malloys. There always are. Oh, but this one did not set terms any longer for Lila Boone. When they stood before the church, months later, Lila wore a blue dress that didn't try to make her something she wasn't. Caleb stood straight with a scar that cut his left shoulder into weathers. The minister didn't speak as if he had invented marriage. He spoke like a man who had seen enough hearts to know what holds and what doesn't. When he asked, "Who gives this woman?" Allah's mother, who had moved out from under the weight of that house by the tracks to live with her sister, stood with a hand that trembled and answered, "She gives herself." It would have been perfect, and perfect things don't often show up on a Wednesday. So of course the back door opened in the middle of the prayer, and Rex Kincaid clattered in with a pistol and fear-eating what was left of him. "Rourke," he said, and every man in the room turned, and half a dozen hands went for half a dozen belts. And the minister sighed because he had seen this church try to belong to God and men at the same time before. "You pay what you owe," Kincaid said, voice shaking. "You pay for the fence and the bullets and the nights I ran." Caleb lifted his empty hands. He looked at Lila. He looked at Kincaid and saw a man who had nothing left to lose, which makes a man dangerous and makes a man sad all at once. He spoke calmly into the dry air. "I owe you this. The truth that you can be more than what you've been paid to be. I owe you this. If you put that gun down and walk outside, the sheriff will talk to you like a man instead of a story. I owe you this. You don't have to be. The hollowness you feel." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't even smart. It was what was in his mouth to say. It almost didn't land. Kincaid's hand shook. He steadied it. Lila moved then, not because she had to, or because she thought she could stop a bullet. She moved because love sometimes makes us forget to be wise and makes us into something better. She stepped slightly in front of Caleb, just enough that Kincaid would have to shoot through the truth to get to the man he hated. She didn't touch Caleb's arm or clutch his coat. She stood easy and looked at Kincaid the way you look at someone you might have known in another life. "Please don't ruin this day," she said. "We ran out of ruined days a while back." The absurdity of it made something like a laugh catch. In the throat of the congregation was a sound like a dam thinking about breaking. Kincaid's eyes went wet. He closed them. His arm dropped. The gun hit the wooden floor with a sound that made the whole church exhale. The sheriff eased up and took Kincaid's shoulder and led him out like a man walking beside another man to keep him from falling. The minister didn't pick up where he left off. He didn't act like nothing had happened. He looked at Caleb and Lila and said quietly, "Your vows just got tested earlier than I thought they would. Say them now." They said the words without shaking. They were not perfect words. They were hard and simple and loving, like the land. After, when the hoopla faded and the cake had been eaten and the sun burned its way down the side of the afternoon, Caleb took Lila's hand and led her to the ridge above the north pasture. The sky stretched so wide it made your chest ache. Grass bowed under wind. Somewhere a hawk traced circles in a pattern older than anyone alive to watch it. "This is where it started," he said. "This is where it hurt. This is where I want it to heal." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the scar that hurt when storms came. "I'm not clean," she said, but the words weren't a confession anymore. They were a memory. "I carried shame like a mantle. I let it tell me what I was. You know better now?" He turned and lifted both her hands to his mouth and kissed them, the palms that had cleaned other people's messes, the fingers that had held on to a tin locket like it was a map. "I know only this. Love is the cleanest thing we have." They stood there until the first star came. They stood there while the sky did what the sky does, whether men keep promises or not. The wind softened, cattle bedded. Coyote called once, and then twice, and then stopped as if even it had run out of reasons to make noise. Sometimes a town heals in places you can't see. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes a woman you loved when you were young walks into your life when you're old and makes you new again. Sometimes she does it after spending years in rooms you can't bear to picture. Sometimes you mend anyway. Sometimes forgiveness looks like a man selling half his east pasture and not regretting it. Sometimes redemption looks like soup and a... Two people stood up against a ledger and a gun and 4 years of silence and chose each other. The town talked. Of course it did. But the wind talked louder in the cottonwood leaves, and the grass talked louder on the hill, and the stars said, what they always say to anyone patient enough to listen, there is a bigger story here than anybody's shame. Thank you, Lila, said one night when the world was quiet. They lay on the porch under a quilt that had belonged to nobody, because new things matter too. Her breath puffed warm in the cool dark. For coming back when I told you to stay away. For standing up when I thought I had to fall down. Land to buy something you could have lost anyway. I didn't buy you, he said, and smiled with his eyes closed. I bought time. You gave me the rest. The moon rose slow. Coyotes sang again. Somewhere a train bellowed and rolled on. And even if every door in town had been left open, and every voice had spoken at once, and every memory had tried to tell, Caleb and Lila, who they were, the night would still have belonged to them. Love had burned bright in a canyon full of echoes and walked them home. Under that sky, a woman once told a man, "Don't lift my skirt, I'm not clean." He had paid, and he had lifted, and he had frozen, not from want but from the sight of a tin locket and the life he had lost. He lifted again, this time a different thing, a weight that kept them separate. He set it down, kept setting it, down every day after. Some truths cut deeper than a blade. Some truths stitch. The best ones do both. And in the stitched places, in the mended seams where life leaks through, a second chance lives like a river in spring, full, cold, shocking, and clean enough to drink.